just want to say thank you everybody for coming. This is First Rounds on Me first live podcast. So a big thing that we like to do with First Rounds on Me and like our core principles are building the right community. And the way that we met our guests for tonight's show is kind of doing that. You know, one thing for us is always trying to surround ourselves with the right community. And James is a good friend of mine. And when I first moved to LA, we got super close. And I realized like being close to the right people, you're organically just gonna spread that love and it's just gonna build your overall family. And through James, I met Caitlin, and Caitlin did an Instagram Live with Dr. Taryn. And a big thing that I do is I just ask people for help. And I'm like, hey, Caitlin, I saw that you did an Instagram Live with Dr. Taryn. She looks amazing. I think she'd be perfect for this podcast we're doing. And Caitlin said, sure, let me introduce you. Got on the phone with Dr. Taryn. And we kind of just spoke about a lot of our morals and values, and they align so well. And with it being Mental Health Awareness Month, and Soho House likes to say on theme, I thought there's no better way than to tie dating and mental health with resilience. And Dr. Taryn, I think, is probably the biggest pro in the world with resilience. She's a New York Times bestselling author. So I'm excited to learn a lot from her. I'm sure she's going to teach us a lot of things. So Dr. Taryn, welcome to the show.
Yeah. All right, so make some noise. Come on. I heard a lot of you before the show told us how much she means to you. So I know there's a lot of familiar faces, and she's already impacted a lot of lives here in such a positive way. So we're so lucky to have her. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted and honored to be here with all of you. I see so many familiar faces. I've got two people here tonight who have actually worked with me on my team, and it was during the pandemic, and we're just meeting in person for the first time. So I've got Mari Katsuya here. There's Mari back there, and Allison Albrecht. And so I see so many beautiful familiar faces and so many people that I don't know. I'm so excited you're here. I can't wait to get to know you.
Amazing. All right, so before we start, I know you would like to offer not only the live audience, but the audience at home a free gift, right? If they're DMing you.
That's true.
So this is Your Resilient Life Guide.
Yes, that's right. So this is something, we're just all about free gifts tonight, because for the folks that are here, you're going to get a free book, and you're going to get a giving key from Caitlin Crosby, which we're so excited about, and you also get an alcoholic beverage.
Me too.
Two of those. First two rounds are on us, not just the first round. And in addition, for those folks that aren't here tonight who weren't able to get the book complimentary, we wanted to take care of all of those folks out in the world. So if you send me a direct message on Instagram at Dr. Taryn Marie, we'll get you the Your Resilient Life ebook. Those of you in the room can have it if you want it. And those folks listening to the recording, we want to give you a little something too. We don't want you to feel left out.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Woo.
All right, so we want to take people through your journey, right? But I want to start with the imaginary slip of paper, because I'm sure a lot of people in here have heard your story, but there's also probably a lot of people who haven't. So let's start with that.
Yeah, whew, I love this one. Well, okay, so we're all about dating tonight, connection, human connection. How's that going? What are we focused on? What's happened in our lives, really in relationships, and specifically, I think, in romantic relationships. And so one of the things that I talk about is that we all walk around with an imaginary slip of paper in our pocket. And the imaginary slip of paper says, people would think I was crazy if they knew, ... And then we fill in the blank. And oftentimes what we put in that blank is our resilient story. What's a resilient story? Glad you asked. A resilient story are the stories that we most need to tell about the times when we faced challenge, change, and complexity, the 3 C's, and often the stories that we most don't want to tell. We're afraid that when people hear these stories, they're going to think differently of us. They're going to see us differently. that our credibility is going to be diminished in some way. And so that imaginary piece of paper, what we would fill in that blank, people would think I was crazy if they knew, is oftentimes our resilient story, the story that we most don't want to tell and most needs to be told. And so what are we navigating in dating relationships? Well, we're navigating a lot of things, but one of the things that we're navigating in dating relationships is being seen in a vulnerable, authentic, and meaningful way. And if we'll be met by that other person in our vulnerability, in our authenticity, if we will be able to be seen and understood in a way that feels good. And so part of navigating dating relationships is how we go about sharing those resilient stories with others in a way that allows us to be truly seen and known in an authentic way. And I'll just say one additional thing about that, which is I get a lot of questions about this, about relationships, is how do I know? How do I know when someone is ready to hear my resilient story? How do I know, what I should share with people, what I should not share with people, what's too early? And so in dating relationships, I talk a lot about the extent to which the person that you're seeing has earned the right to hear your resilient stories. What have they done to earn that place in your life and to demonstrate for you that if you are to open up and to begin to share one of those stories from your imaginary piece of paper, that you will be met with that being seen and known and understood that we all inherently desire in relationships.
I mean, you just answered like 9 of my questions.
Drinks for everyone. Let's head to the bar.
No, I love that. And I think when we first spoke, we threw the word vulnerability a lot out there. And I think there's like a stigma on that word, and people don't understand that word too deeply, especially around men, right? And I think the modern day man, if you are vulnerable, it actually is a sign of strength, right? Maybe 20 years ago, even still today, if a man comes off vulnerable, they think it's a sign of weakness. But I think from what I've learned in my relationship is what you said, right? When you're vulnerable, you're being your true self and creating a safe zone for not only you, but your partner to be vulnerable. And I think that's like one of the first steps to a healthy relationship. So I think being vulnerable is such a misunderstood word, and it's one of my favorite relationship words now.
I love this. Can we riff on vulnerability for a moment?
For sure.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I love that you brought up the male perspective on vulnerability, and it's so powerful. Let me tee up a couple of things for all of you in the room who might be hearing about my work or resilience, for just the first time. The first thing that we get to start from is that resilience is the essence of being human. So there's this idea, I think, that's been propagated, at least, in sort of our culture, that resilience is something we go out and get. It's something that we find. It's something that, we earn, maybe. And resilience isn't something out there that we go and get. Resilience is something that's the essence of being human. It's something that exists already inside of us. So one of the things that I talk about is these moments when we face the 3 C's, the challenge, change, and complexity, is that we don't have to go out and find resilience. It actually already lives inside of us. And when we think about that frame shift, that's so powerful for us as humans to begin to think that the things that we most want and we most need and we most desire in terms of characteristics, that those things aren't something we've got to go out and find in the world. Those are actually things that are already within us. They're not something we go out and find. They're something that we already are. So we get to start from this place of not, are you resilient or are you resilient enough, or this sort of shaming, I think, that's happened for so many people, and recognizing that we are complete just as we are. One of the last things that I say in the book is I say that we are all masterpieces. And a lot of you will push back against that in your mind. And I say we're all masterpieces, and we're also all works in progress. And what that means is, as a masterpiece, we're all perfect. in this moment, just as we are. We don't need to be bigger or stronger or earn more money or more sensitive or kinder or more aware or conscientious. It's like in this moment, we are all masterpieces. We're perfect in our humanity, and we're all works in progress. We're all on our journey. We're all enhancing ourselves. We're not going to stay here. We're going to continue to get better. So now on over to vulnerability. So resilience is really the essence of being human. It's about facing the inevitable moments of challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 C's. And it's about being able to face what comes our way, those inevitable moments, and over time, allowing those moments to enhance us, not diminish us. And so what I did, in my abundant spare time in the last 20 years, is I interviewed hundreds of people and I collected thousands of pieces of data, and I asked people one simple and powerful question. I asked them to think about a time that they faced challenge and to tell me about how they effectively faced that challenge. What did they do that they felt like was effective in that moment for them? And then, just for fun on Saturday nights, I coded all that qualitative data to see if there are commonalities around how do we effectively face challenges as humans. Like in those moments when challenge shows up in our lives, where someone in our life gets, a health diagnosis, where, we experience rejection, someone that we thought we were going to be with forever, that relationship ends, someone passes away in an untimely way. In those moments where we're literally, or at least figuratively in our own minds, saying to ourselves, what am I going to do? What if we had a playbook in those moments? What if we actually knew what to do? What if we knew how to create a more positive and productive outcome? And so what that is the 5 practices of highly resilient people. That's the blueprint for what we can do anytime we face challenge, change, and complexity to be able to create a more positive and productive outcome. And the first practice, dun, 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 drum roll please, is vulnerability, right? Now, after resilience, vulnerability is probably the next most misunderstood word that I talk about, because we think about vulnerability in a lot of ways. We think about vulnerability as being completely transparent. We think about vulnerability as weakness, as you mentioned, Joe. We think about vulnerability as being self-deprecating or self-effacing. Like we're all still in middle school and we're going to point out the things that we feel insecure about before somebody else does. And in fact, none of those things are vulnerability. Vulnerability is allowing our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and experience to as closely as possible match the outside self that we share with the world. And the closer those 2 things are together, the internal self and the outside self, the more vulnerable we're being. And we'll be more vulnerable in some circumstances and less vulnerable in others, and that's okay. And for anyone who's got a psychology background in here, or who has just, spent some time in therapy, myself included, you're familiar with the word congruence. And what congruence means is that the inside self, thoughts, feelings, and experiences, as closely as possible, match the outside self that we're sharing with the world. So that's vulnerability. And I'll talk for a moment about what gets in the way of vulnerability. But before I do that, I want to address something that's so powerful that you brought up, Joe, which is vulnerability and men. Because I think we do. I have 2 little boys. My son Samson, who's 11, he's not so little anymore. He's getting closer and closer to looking me in the eye. And, we do, I think, in our society, a disservice, to men and to women. We've talked a lot about, for women, I love Reshma Saujani, for anyone who's familiar with her work, Brave Not Perfect, Girls Who Code. And we talk about how women start to lose our self-confidence in our early teen years. Mary Pfeiffer wrote a beautiful book about this about 20 years ago called Reviving Ophelia, for anyone who's familiar with her. And we've talked a lot about how women can lose that sense of self-confidence in early adolescence. What we haven't, I don't think, talked as much about is that we take something very important away from men about a decade earlier. Between the ages of 3 and 5, we start to tell little boys that they're the man of the house. We start to talk with them about being strong. We start to talk with them about don't cry when you fall down, And so we begin in the ways that our society treats men to cut men off from their feelings, from their emotional process. And we ask you not to feel, and we ask you to keep it all inside. And then about 20 years later, that little boy who's 3 or 5 grows up and maybe gets into his first romantic relationship. And maybe his partner says to him, "How was your day? How do you feel about that?" And dudes are like, "Whoa, that's been programmed out of me for the last 2 decades. I have no idea how to answer that question." And I think one of the tremendous opportunities that we have today in the world of dating and in the world of thinking about bringing back together holistically what is the feminine and what is the masculine, and how do we really honor those gifts and that energy that exists within all of us, is to have men in our society who get to reconnect with their emotions, who get to reconnect with your emotional experience, who we get to see as strong and brave and courageous, even as you have tears, running down your face, right? And how we get to span that dichotomy. And I'll just tell you a brief story about this. I've been talking for a long time, sorry. And I'll tell you a brief story. So I was talking to my boyfriend this morning at coffee, and I was like, I'm probably going to tell some stories about us. I'm not really sure which ones. So just tell me if there's something you don't want me to say. He's like, no, I think everything's fine. You can tell any story. So I'm like, great. So hopefully this is an okay story to tell. And it was the thing, I'm sure you've all experienced this. I was at a wedding in Mexico, and he wasn't with me, and I felt like I had like a foot in 2 canoes the whole time, right? I was there with the wedding, and I was seeing my friend get married, and it was so beautiful. And then I was also like checking in with him, and like, what's he doing? And how's he doing? And how are we doing? And we're missing each other, right? So it's this, sort of feeling that I'm, just in 2 places at once, that I'm sort of split in half. And so I'd been planning this trip with friends to Croatia, where I was going to be gone for 9 days. And I was like, whoa, these 3 days did not feel that great, not super pumped about it. He was so nice about it. And so I got to the hotel last night, and I figured out I'm not going to go to Croatia. Not because I can't, and not because I don't want to, but because when I do go to Croatia, I want it to be with him. I want to see all those beautiful things with him by my side, holding hands. And so last night, in the Uber on the way in, I'm like, hey, I have news emoji. I think you're gonna like it. And I got there, and we were in bed, and he was sort of over me, and I said, I want to tell you the news now. And he was like, okay. And I was like, well, do you want the bad news first or the good news first? He's like, I don't know. And I was like, well, okay, let me tell you how I like to do it. I like to get the bad news first, so then I can look forward to the good news. Because if I get the good news first, then I'm thinking about it versus the bad news. Enjoy it. So that's how I do it. Resilience trick, just from me to you, practical application. And so I said, okay, so the bad news is you're gonna have to see me for those 10 days in June when I was supposed to be in Croatia. And he looked at me, it was so beautiful. He burst into tears. Someone from the audience said he's a keeper in case I didn't get picked up on the audio. But see, this is my point, Steve and Joe. We want you to burst into tears.
I'm on the verge right now.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this out loud, so if I can't, just edit it out. We fucking love that.
We prefer the person. So
Okay, fucking great.
As long as it's congruent with your inner self.
Absolutely. My inner self is like, fuck yeah right now. So he bursts into tears, and, he's just, like kind of hovering over in bed, and the tears are falling on my face. And I'm like, this is the best moment of my life, I think. And so my point is, like, I don't even have to say it, like, you all heard the response from the room. So many female voices in a chorus being like, yes, I love that, keep him, we love that guy. And like, this is the divine masculinity. This is, I can speak for myself as a woman, this is what I crave. That strength, that sense of protection, that steadiness, that sense of stability, and also someone who can show up, burst into tears, and just like cover me with their tears with a rainstorm. Like, I'm here for it. And so I'm so excited about creating an environment where we allow you as men to have that vulnerability, because for me as a woman, and for so many women, you can hear the response, we're craving it.
Yeah, Joe, I'll tee you up because I know you like to talk about this, but one of the things we talk about a lot on our podcast and from talking to other people is the idea of chivalry and vulnerability being two separate things that can coexist, right? So
I think, from the research that we do, definitely not as much as you, but we just saw like this new shift in the world where women were saying, just because we want to be treated equally does not mean that we don't want you to be chivalrous still. And I think it's important for men to know that being chivalrous is not an old school traditional superiority thing. It's more just showing a woman that they're seen, heard, and valued, right? I think with vulnerability, that it also goes hand in hand with support, being a support system, right? We think in the old school way, support system is someone who provides and takes care and protects physically. But I think in the modern world, support is like, again, giving that safe zone to feel, men and women are always going to speak different languages, but giving your woman a safe space to say what's on her mind, speak her truth, and you just accepting that. And you may disagree with her, but not being so combative and saying like, you're wrong, or this is what's right to me. It's just creating that supportive, safe system and allowing both you and your partner to be vulnerable. So that's what I think chivalry and equality looks like in 2023, but that's my perspective. I could be totally wrong.
One thing I'm going to read this directly because I'll butcher it otherwise, but something I heard you say recently that I thought was profound was you said part of self-love and self-acceptance is about loving and integrating all parts of ourselves. This includes loving our past selves, the versions that got us where we are today. So I know a lot of times, like, looking back on our lives, we may have made mistakes or done things that we don't like, but you're saying that we need to embrace those, right?
I am saying that, yeah. What I'm saying is, in that and other versions of what I've said there is, we can't engage in true self-love today in this moment and hate the parts of ourselves that got us here. We can't love ourselves deeply and hate experiences that we've had, regrets that we have, or even dislike. We do a thing as humans where, and this exists in the vulnerability practice too, where we have a tendency to cut ourselves off from the parts of ourselves that we don't like, as opposed to figuring out how we can love and accept and integrate those parts of ourselves. And when we're cut off from parts of ourselves, what that means is that we also have a tendency to cut other people in our lives off from parts of their selves, right? And so one of the things that I talk about is that our ability to love other people, to love people in a relationship, whether that's a same-sex relationship, whether it's a heterosexual relationship, whether it's our children or whether that's our parents, our ability to love people, to have big capacity for love, is limited only by our ability to love ourselves. And so often we think that other people are easier to love than it is to love ourselves. And that's true until they do something wrong. And then we're like, forget that person. So when we think about dating relationships, the most important person for us to have in our lives, the most important person for us to be in relationship, and this falls into the third practice of the third practice of connection, is the connection with ourselves. The most important person for us to love and be in relationship is that person that's sitting right there with you. And I want you to go home. I want you to do something tonight. I hope you'll do it. I want you to go home, and 50% of you will feel super weird doing this, and that's the point, is to get comfortable with something that makes us uncomfortable. I want you to look in the mirror at yourself. Not like look in the mirror at yourself to like see how attractive you are today. You're all looking fabulous. Not to look in the mirror at the parts of yourself that you don't like, the things that you wish you could change, like whatever. No, it's like really look at yourself. Look into the eyes of the person staring back at you in the mirror. Because this is the person that has been with you your whole life. And this is the person that's going to be with you the whole rest of your life. And so many of us, myself included, are deeply, deeply wounded, traumatized, triggered by abandonment. People leaving unexpectedly in deeply hurtful ways. And the most profound way that we experience abandonment as humans is actually self-abandonment. It's not listening to ourselves. It's not keeping promises to ourselves. It's not doing the things that we said that we were going to do, or going against our values or our desires because we want to please people and make other people happy. So what we all get to do is to go home tonight and to look in the mirror at our beautiful selves and to say, I'm never going to leave you again. That's my promise to you. Because as long as we're with ourselves, as long as we love ourselves, we've got a great capacity to love other people in relationships. And as long as we're showing up for ourselves, we can't be abandoned. We're not going to abandon ourselves. And telling ourselves that we're just going to let go of letting go of us. And maybe for the first time in a long time, or the first time in our whole lives, or maybe you're an expert at not abandoning yourself, we're going to show up and look at ourselves in the mirror and really see ourselves and say, I'm going to show up for you, and I'm not going to leave you again.
I love that. Yeah, and I think, that was so profound. And I think, a simple compliment, right? Like if I was to compliment Steve or you and you weren't in the right headspace, it would make our day, right? But like you're saying, why can't you compliment yourself, and why can't you validate yourself, and why do you need the external world to tell you that you look good? And I think if we retrain our brains to kind of say, hey, I'm good, I look good, I don't need somebody else to tell me. If they do, that's great. But I think, a lot of us need that outside validation when, again, it's not as strong as our inner validation, and it's only going to hold on for so long. So I think that was very profound. So thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
I want to talk about something else that I know that everybody can relate to, and that's the idea of story versus narrative, right? Especially as it pertains to relationships and breakups, because I'm sure we've all finished a relationship and then, the story is the story, right? That's the facts versus the narrative we tell ourselves of why we weren't good enough, what we could have did, better. And I'll let you take it from there. Please.
Oh, I love this. So good. Okay, so in our lives, we all have stories. We all have stories, and stories are the things that happened, like that series of events. And then a narrative is the story about the story. So the story is what happened. We're not necessarily going to be able to change that. The narrative, the story that we tell ourselves about that story and how we make sense of what happened, that is completely inside of our control. And that's beautiful. So when I was growing up, I'll give you the short version of the story. It's in the book. When I was growing up, pretty early, at age 14, I was getting dressed for school in the morning, in my ground floor bedroom. And the window on the ground floor was opened, just a couple of inches, and the shade was down the rest of the way. I was like getting ready for my freshman, my day of, being a freshman in high school. And I was playing music. And I was playing music from this thing that you might have heard of. It's called a stereo. And my mom was in the kitchen churning butter. No, I'm just kidding. And so we didn't always play music from our phones. Some of you might not know. And so there's music playing from the stereo. And so I went over to turn off the music, and there was this space at the bottom of my window. It's still dark outside. And so I was looking, and I was trying to figure this out, and I was flipping through all the experiences that I'd had to make sense of what was happening right then in my 14-year-old mind. And I thought about this time when my dad was outside and he was playing a trick on us. And so I said, "Dad?" And he said, "Take off your clothes, you're beautiful." And I thought, "Not Dad." And then it sort of felt like a horror movie. I don't watch scary movies, but when I do, it sort of feels like the room's closing in around me. And so it felt like that, like the room was closing in around me and I just had to get out of there. And so I ran, I was calling for my parents, and we called the police and made the police report, and the police were all, this is probably just a fluke, someone passing through the neighborhood. And so fast forward, 10 months later, I was in my bedroom again, and I had that window shut, and then I had another window, the other window that only faced the backyard, the back of the house, open. And I had just gotten undressed. And I heard his voice again. And he said, "I've been waiting a long time for this." And for me, in that moment, 3 things changed. One, my childhood bedroom, which for me and for all of us should be a safe place, became profoundly unsafe. The second thing is that I recognized this was not a fluke. And I was naked in front of a man for the first time. And I started calling for help. Because I was like, my parents were out of town this time. We had babysitters, they had little kids, they were doing the nighttime routine upstairs. And I was like, do I run out of my bedroom naked in front of my babysitters? And so I was calling for help. And from the window, he said to me, "No one's going to come and help you." And you know what? They couldn't hear me. But I did have a phone. I did have a phone in my room. I had my own phone line because I got good grades. And so I picked up the phone and I called the police. And then I went into shock. I don't remember what happened for the next 5 or 10 minutes. And for a long time in my life, the story of no one's going to come and help me when I need them most was something that I believed. Until I realized that I could rewrite those set of events. And even though that story won't change, I can write a new narrative. And I can write a narrative that doesn't allow him to keep being right, that people won't come and help me. I can write a narrative and privilege the experiences where people have shown up for me, and write a new narrative that allows me then to have a new experience with those events.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, again, another profound moment, but yeah, I always tell people there's two ways you go through every story, and your experience kind of better tells what I preach, in the sense that no matter how bad something is, as long as we're progressing and building our own narratives, no matter what we're doing in life, we control that, right? We can't control the situations we were put in, we can't control the situations we were born in, but we control each day how we look at the next day and what we learned from that previous day. And yeah, I don't have any experiences like that, but the fact that you can kind of validate what I preach makes me believe that what I tell people is actually true. So this is helping me right now preach what collectively we're doing.
And reinforcing your narrative.
Yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'll say one more thing about that, which is, and I think this is important because there's not a single person in this room who hasn't experienced some difficulty, some loss, some hurt, some pain, some trauma, some rejection, some crisis, some health diagnosis. And so we're all of us here are profoundly human. And, you know, I talk about this idea of the unique and the universal. And for all of us as humans, it's so easy to believe that our lives are so unique. And they're really not in some ways, right? Like, we all have our unique, nuanced experience. And what it means to be human is to have a profoundly universal experience. We've all experienced loss. We've all experienced disappointment, rejection, hurt, sadness, elation. And so what we have in common is much greater than what makes us different. You know, we have this universal experience of what it means to feel and have these things in our lives. And one of the things that I think is important for all of us to recognize is that whatever it is that, you know, happened to you, or the thing that you're working on, or what you're attempting to integrate, or how you're attempting to elevate, you know, that thing that happened to you is not your fault. What is important for you to know, what is your responsibility, is the healing. We're all responsible for our own healing, even though we're not responsible necessarily for things that happen to us that were against, you know, our will or outside of our control.
Yeah, I'm going to tie that into dating, because I know I want to talk about dating a little bit, but that's a good segue. And I feel like that's what we do in the world today, especially with dating apps, right? We're in this instant validation mode, and you could go on the best dating app date in your life, right? And the way our brains are being trained and operating now, we can come home from that date and just go back to that natural reaction of just going back on the app to just see what else is out there, because that's how we're trained, right? And then on the opposite side of that, if you have a bad first date, we're looking for that next best thing instead of taking time to work on ourselves. And I think I could speak from experience with this with my wife, but when we first got together, we had a lot of growing to do, and we took a big break. And we both felt like, oh, in the break, we're going to go meet other people and have fun. But we did the opposite. We were like, there's some deep meaning to our love and our connection, but I'm not there to receive or give what that other person wanted. And instead of trying to find somebody else to fill a void, I was like, I just want to figure out how I can make myself better moving forward. And in a weird way, I did that and she did that, and we happened to get coffee after 3 months, and we both looked at each other and just said, wow, you worked on all the things that you needed to work on. And I said that to her. And I think that's what we need to do, is like not take dating personal and not take so many things personal, and the more you work on yourself, the more attractive you become, and the more happy you become with yourself, where you don't need somebody else, and it just becomes easier to need somebody else. But yeah, sorry I brought it back into the dating app world, but it was a great segue.
We're here to talk about dating. Do you guys want to hear the craziest dating story I ever had?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, this is my craziest dating story ever, which happened in my 40s. I'm not 40 anymore, obviously, but, back when no. So I sort of had this belief, right, that like all the crazy things that were going to happen in my dating life were going to happen earlier in life. I had this belief. So I was new to the dating apps, right? And this is going to reinforce what you're talking about, Joe, around doing the work on ourselves. And so, it was May of 2020, pandemic time, right? And so I had sat in an ayahuasca ceremony in February, right before the pandemic showed up. And one of the many incredible pieces of wisdom that I got inside of that ceremony was that I had like a lot of men in my life who were not the one. And, there were, various kind of flirtations and like interactions happening. And what I understood is that if I really wanted to call in the one, right, what I needed to do was to clean off my relationship table. Like, just as when we go to someone's house or when we go out to, let's use a restaurant as an example. When we sit down at a restaurant, right, if there's like napkins and crumbs and like a glass with things that are like, we're like, can we have another table? Can you come and judge this up, right? So I think it's the same thing with dating a lot of times. Like, we don't want to come into someone's like half-eaten meal. We want to come into like a clean table, a clean slate, someone who's done the work. And so one by one, I called all of these people and I said, hey, thank you so much for being in my life. I'm so grateful that we connected. I recognize that we have, sort of this flirtation thing going on, or, that we have this interaction. And I wanted to call you and thank you for being in relationship with me, and also share with you that I won't be engaging in this way anymore. I'm going to call this romantic energy back to myself, and I'm going to keep it within me until I find a one person that I want to invest in next, right? So I've done the work there. So then in May, I meet this person in the midst of the pandemic, and we start dating. And he's flying back and forth to San Francisco. And so I say to him, San Francisco was a hotbed in COVID. And I said, I'm really worried about you flying back and forth to San Francisco. And what happens if you get COVID and you get sick and you can't come back, and then you're stuck in a hotel room and nobody knows where you are? He's like, no, that'll never happen. And I'm like, okay, right? So we end up breaking up. It's a bit of a fiery breakup. And I triggered his abandonment, he triggered my abandonment, and it was all a big fiery crash, right? And so we were lightly in touch for another couple of weeks. And he reaches out to me, he traveled to New Orleans, and he tells me that, he just done a photo shoot for his brand, his product, and he's gonna come home the next day. And then the next day I get a text message from him, and he tells me that he's not feeling well. And even though everyone who COVID tested, they just found out that one of the people that he was working with closely had COVID. This goes on. And so he tells me that he's in his hotel room and he's super sick, and and I'm just sort of really concerned about him. And then that night, my intuition came in. And so for those of you that have cultivated your intuition, it sounds like different things to different people. For me, it's a voice that comes in, and my intuition came in and it said, he's not in New Orleans in a hotel room. He's at home in his house, pretending because he knows this was your greatest fear, and he's trying to get back at you. I was like, this shit just got weird, my intuition. So I'm like, okay, well, what am I gonna do? So I message him and I'm like, hey, how are you feeling? How are things? He's like, oh, I was on the bathroom floor, digestive issues, I'm having trouble breathing. I'm like, hey, do you think you could FaceTime me from that hotel room that you're in? Just so I can see you, just to be reassured. No, he could not FaceTime, he could not, he was too sick. So that night, I drove to his house. And I was like, one of two things is gonna happen here. Either I'm gonna find out that I'm right, or I'm gonna find out that I'm crazy. But either way, I look forward to meeting myself. So I drive out there. Sure enough, the lights are on in this house. And so like any good person in the midst of COVID would, I take off my shoes and get real close to the window to make sure it's him. And it is, you know. So then I had this bag of things, like when you end a relationship, you have like a bag of things and you're supposed to mail them back, and I hadn't mailed the bag of things back. So I brought it with me. So I go to my car and I send him one more text message. And I'm like, hey, when do you think you're gonna feel well enough to come home? Right? And he messages, well, it's probably gonna be a couple days. And I'm like, So I take that bag of all of his things and I put it up on the doorstep. And I light a match. Just kidding, I didn't light a match. But I did ring the doorbell, so he knew that I was there and I caught him. And then I ran away and drove off. So then I thought to myself, what is it that attracted this type of person into my life? What kind of work do I get to do on myself? And myself said, you're freaking perfect. Go back on the dating app. That was all his stuff.
That's awesome. So I think two things that I speak about when it comes to what we're just talking about. The first thing I think is take a lesson from every date you go on, right? Because you learn what you do want and what you don't want. And then I have a lot of friends.
Where were you at this moment for your job?
I just started doing this. I have a lot of friends, both men and women, who say, like, this is what I expect in a partner. I only want someone who does X, Y, and Z. And I thoroughly ask them, and I say, that's great, but if that person walked into your life right now, would they like what they see in you? And sometimes people give that response of like, yeah, I'm perfect. And it's like, okay, you're probably not going to attract that person. Or I've seen some of my friends say, yeah, you know what? I do want someone who's so nice, kind, intentional, has a great job, and is amazing. But am I giving all that energy for them to be attracted to me? And sometimes it's a profound moment for them to be like, shoot, I need to do some work on myself to attract that amazing person that I want. So those are the two things that I kind of preach that I took out of that.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and the end of that story was really tongue in cheek, right? Because on the one hand, I think it's really important for us not to take responsibility for other people's bad behavior. And to not blame ourselves when people act in certain ways that are out of integrity, that are condescending, that are degrading, right? And then I think the piece of control, to your point, Joe, that we have there is to look within ourselves and to say, and even though I'm not responsible for that person's behavior, what am I putting out into the world that's potentially attracting that? What can I look within myself and shore up? What can I shine up? What are the ways in my life that I'm judgmental? What are the ways in my life that I'm impatient? What are the ways in my life that I'm dismissive? And then how can I create more expansion in those areas of my life? And especially to your point, inside of the qualities that we most want to find in a partner, because we all know that we're mirrors for other people. So the things that we most want in the world, being able to put those things out into the world, that generosity, that kindness, that patience, that unconditional love, we get back what we put in, right? And so being able to find those ways within ourselves where we can do more and be more and connect with ourselves deeply, to be our own soulmate before we go off looking for that outside of ourselves.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I see it's getting dark. I don't know how much time we have left, but I do want to do a Q&A. I don't know, see you get a lot of stuff on there still?
Yeah, so I was going to say maybe we could just put a bow on the 5 practices, because I think we're up to number 4, which when I heard it for the first time, rather than reading it, I spent 10 minutes Googling a fake word that you made up that did not exist. So yeah, maybe we can wrap up 4 and 5, and then we can move to the Q&A.
Sure, I'd love to do that. So just to put a bow on the 5 practices and how we can think about those with dating. So, we interviewed hundreds of people, we collected thousands of pieces of data, we found that there are commonalities in how we collectively as humans most effectively face challenge and create a better outcome in those inevitable 3C moments that challenge, change, and complexity. And so at a high level, those practices that are the blueprint for us in those moments when we face challenge are vulnerability, allowing our inside self to match the outside self that we share with the world, productive perseverance. This is the intelligent pursuit of a goal. A lot of people ask me, do resilient people stick with things no matter what? Yes, they do. And people say, do resilient people quit stuff wholesale, just walk away? Yes, they do. So productive perseverance is about the intelligent pursuit of a goal. It's knowing when to maintain the mission despite challenge and when to pivot in a new direction in the face of diminishing returns. And then we have connection, which is 2 parts. The connection that we have with ourselves, first and foremost, trusting our gut, loving ourselves deeply, saying nice things to ourselves in our minds, that self-talk. And then it's about the connection that we have externally with the world and how we navigate our internal connection alongside those external connections. The 4th practice is gradiosity. So this is the fake word that you can't get those 10 minutes back, I'm sorry. So what I was hearing from people is that when they effectively faced challenge, 2 things sort of happened in tandem. One was, after something difficult happened, they were able to look on that challenge after some time with a sense of gratitude. Not in the moment, right? Like I wasn't putting that bag on the doorstep and being like, I'm so glad this is happening, I'm becoming a better person. I was like, are you kidding me right now? Right? But after some time, when we get the distance, and then the generosity, which really builds on that foundation of vulnerability, which is to generously be able to share our resilient stories with the world for 2 reasons. One, when we share resilient stories, when we share the things on that imaginary slip of paper, we are solidifying, internalizing what we did in that moment, how we demonstrated resilience, how we got through a thing that we didn't know we were going to get through. And then we're also generously sharing our story for others, because we're shining a light on someone else's journey. There's someone out there saying, you know what, because he did it or because she did it, I think I can too. And we become part of someone else's survival guide. We become a part of cheering someone else on, whether we know it or not, on their journey. And then the 5th practice is the practice of possibility. And the practice of possibility is about focusing on progress rather than perfection. And it's about how we navigate these inevitable moments of opportunity and risk that create new possibilities anytime we face a challenge. And those are the 5 practices.
I love that. I actually heard today before this, Joe Dispenza said, if you believe in possibilities, you have to believe in yourself. And if you believe in yourself, you have to believe in possibility. So
Joe Dispenza and I are just basically saying the same stuff.
Perfect time.
I'll call him up later.
Awesome.
All right, yeah, we can open it up to a Q&A. So does anyone want to start?
I do, but
Woo!
I want to be respectful of the time. Should I?
We'll worry about the time.
Okay.
Yes.
Should I just ask all three and then you'll answer which ones you want?
I'm so excited about this. I don't know. What should we do?
Yeah, let's go all three. Yeah, let's.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
will you
They're
tell me?
really good questions. I think we'll be
No
good.
doubt.
I gotta-
Will you tell us your name?
Hi everyone.
Hi.
I'm Andrea.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi. I'm shy now. Okay. Okay. So my three questions. So in the beginning, you said the other person should earn your resilience story.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure there's some sort of litmus test that you do when getting to know someone that will gauge whether or not they've earned that.
Yeah.
I think there's also different variables to
Mhm.
know whether or not they earn that.
Right.
The kind of work they've done, therapy, psychology, self-work, accountability, etc. So
Yeah.
I wanted to know that.
Okay, so you want to know how folks
How
earn
to
it?
know when they earn it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how, because I think there's also like how a lot of us have been through very different things, like very, very deep, maybe less deep. Or,
Yeah.
So how do you gauge whether or not that person earns your resilience story?
Yeah.
One-on-one,
Yeah.
dating-wise, I'd say.
I feel like I want to answer that right now.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll say the other two.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I'm gonna answer it.
Great.
We're going in.
Yay.
Okay. So what you should do is you should get that person in the car, and then you should go drive somewhere and pretend like you don't have Wi-Fi and tell them you're lost, and then see what happens next.
Love that.
Yeah.
And then based on how they handle that, we go from there.
We go from there.
Love that.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
But seriously, I mean, I do mean that, right? But it's we can learn so much from people about what happens just in these like sort of microscopic moments where we lose a sense of control, where we're late for something, where who knows, right? Traffic, being late, getting lost. Like these are things that we get to look at. How does this person respond to sort of these unanticipated, ambiguous moments? And that's going to tell us a lot about how they're going to respond to us when they don't feel like we're saying something favorable, or when we sort of become that thing that in our resilience story might feel a little messy or a little ambiguous. And then I think the next thing you do, like Andrea, you wisely said the word litmus test, right? So I don't like to lead with my like biggest trauma first. I like to start in with like a lowercase trauma and just see how that goes. Right? And none of us in this room are narcissists, but we know people that are narcissists. They're not here tonight. And people with narcissistic tendencies. And one of the things that people with narcissistic tendencies like to do in relationships, which is very traumatizing to all of us in this room who are not narcissistic, is when we tell them that vulnerable thing about ourselves, they bring it up later in an opportune moment. And folks use that story to wound us. And that is profoundly unfair. And so I was in a relationship with someone who had narcissistic tendencies. And I told him one of the most hurtful things that had ever happened in my whole life, which was when my husband and I, at the time, sat down and told my parents that we were planning to get a divorce. And we had 2 small children at the time, 2.5 and 5. My mom stood up and said, "I just don't think I should be your mother anymore." So I was like, fantastic, divorce and abandonment, this is wonderful. Speaking it all out. And so I told him that story and how hurtful that had been in our relationship. And, maybe 6 months later, in the midst of an argument, I did something that he didn't like. And he said, "Your mom was right to say that she shouldn't be your mother anymore." So that's what we don't want to happen, right? We want to start with some things and try it out and see how that percolates and matriculates inside of our relationship and then go from there. And the last thing that I'll say is, every time we share a resilience story that's near and dear to our hearts, people will not always react positively, graciously, lovingly, and it's really, really, really important for us to remember that that has nothing to do with us and our story and our lovability, and everything to do with their capacity in that moment to be able to hear us.
Love that, thank you. Yeah, so I'm gonna piggyback on that with my third question. We're just gonna skip to that because it has to do with that.
Did I answer your second question already?
No, not yet, we're gonna get back to second.
Okay,
We're just
okay.
gonna
One for
review
two.
it really quick. Yeah, so third question was, and I loved how you were joking and you were like, dropped off the bag and you were like, I'm perfect, there was nothing wrong with me. I don't know if you were really ending your story there because we touched a little bit on accountability and like looking within and what attracted you to that man.
Yeah.
So there are all of these opposing theories, right? Of like, you attract what you are. We're all a mirror, law of attraction. But then there's also these theories like the empath is a magnet for narcissists. So can we touch on that a little bit?
Sure.
Great.
Okay, what are we touching on now?
The different theories, and can you make sense of them so that I can properly digest being this human that I am?
No problem.
Thanks. You wrote a book, right? You got this.
Okay, I'm still not sure what you want to know though.
They can all coexist. Is that the
Okay.
answer? All the theories coexist. While we are mirrors for each other, we can also attract the polar opposite of what we don't need. Or
Okay, yes, great question. So think of accountability as a continuum, right? And maybe I'm just gonna make this up right now. So on one side of the continuum is responsibility, and then on the other side of the continuum is accountability, right? And we get to toggle back and forth between responsibility and accountability in all of our interactions and all of our relationships. And there are those of us in here who, in some ways in our life, could all stand to be a little more responsible for how we treat people, for how we show up, for the extent to which we consider other people's feelings, right? And then there's, for those of us in here, we also get to be accountable to ourselves and how we show up in the world. And so for the person who has the opportunity, say, to be more responsible externally, right? In these types of moments, we get to think about, okay, what was I doing that created this? What called this in? What brought this person into my life? How do I think about doing things differently? There's also people who tend to be overly responsible for everything. And so these are folks that get to say, hey, I'm going to be more accountable to myself and not take responsibility for someone else's behavior that clearly is not my own, right? The reason that people stay so long in abusive relationships, emotionally, sexually, physically abusive relationships, is because the people that stay, that are having those things perpetrated against them, believe for a period of time that it's their fault, right? They believe they're responsible for that behavior. And so responsibility is incredibly powerful because it allows us to take control of what's within our span of control in life, but when overused, it allows us to stay too long in relationships that don't serve us and in fact are profoundly detrimental, right? So I think we get to look deeply at what elements of a relationship am I responsible for externally, and then how can I be accountable to myself and not take on things that are not my responsibility.
great, thank you. Yeah. So
I would also add to that, to kind of answer your question.
Jump on in here,
love
Steve.
that.
I have beef with like TikTok therapists. I'm not saying you fall into that trap, but I feel like we're so quick to see these things on TikTok and label them and say, oh, this person's that or this person's that. So I would say just be weary of that. And I'm not saying you do this, but probably talking to myself mostly. But yeah, I feel like people look for like a quick fix to label something or label someone so they can kind of fix their problem. So I would say just be on alert about that.
Thank you. Yeah. Great. And the last question was, would you say that the deep desire for acceptance is synonymous to the deep fear of abandonment?
You're not gonna let me off easy, are you?
Do you think it's easy having this brain? It's fucking exhausting.
I love it. Oh my God. Okay, wait, one more time. What?
The desire to be accepted is
Okay.
synonymous to the fear of abandonment, or would you say they're different?
I know, that's why I got 10 at 10.
So good. So good. So let's think of abandonment and acceptance as a Venn diagram, shall we? Let's do it. So my belief in my training in marriage and family therapy and neuropsychology would lead me to believe that abandonment and acceptance are like a Venn diagram. So we've got one circle for abandonment, and we've got one circle for acceptance. And abandonment, the fear of it, the trauma of it, self-abandonment, abandonment by other people, right? That's one sphere, literally and figuratively, all of its own. And then acceptance, the desire to belong, to be included, to be seen, is another sphere, right? And for some of us, the experience of abandonment and acceptance can live in the middle of those two circles when they overlap in the center of that Venn diagram. So I wouldn't say that acceptance is, call it the cure for abandonment, right? And that when we want to be accepted, it comes from a place of abandonment. We can desire acceptance for a variety of reasons that don't necessarily have the genesis in abandonment.
So glad that was your answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Amazing.
She's like, and I'm done. That's all I
That
need.
was so great.
Wrap this up.
It was a no. The answer is no, they're not synonymous.
They're not synonymous.
Thank you.
The Venn diagram.
Perfect.
Yes. Great.
Love
All right. I hope you all have some easier questions.
You got one.
My name is Johannes. Hi, thank you very much.
Hi, Johannes.
I had a question about if you could just comment on attachment theory. I recently read this book, Attached, and I think
I love
it really
attached.
spoke to me. I know it's not necessarily related to resilience per se, but yeah, I could just comment on that. And to what extent do you think that these things like anxious or avoidant person attachment styles are immutable, or to what extent you can change those kinds of things?
So good. All right, who here has read Attached?
Love that book.
I love it too.
From there.
Litmus test from there. Thanks, Andrea. All right, so if you're in the dating world and you really wanted to like rock your whole life, you might be like, adult attachment theory sounds amazing. Thanks, Dr. Taryn. It's so fascinating, this book Attached. The author's name is Levine, right? And then there's like one other person who I can never remember. Johannes is gonna look it up. It's got a magnet on the front on Amazon. I devoured this book. I have like a doctorate in neuropsychology, blah, blah, blah. I was like, why didn't they teach this in neuropsychology school? This would save me a lot of time. So right after you read the 5 practices of highly resilient people, you can read Attached. And so, one of the things that you bring up, Johannes, this book is so powerful. So it talks about 3 attachment styles, right? We've got avoidant, we've got anxious, and secure is the way that they break it down. And so attachment theory, as I'm sure you've seen, we evaluate this in children, and then we can also have an attachment style in adulthood. And then based on our attachment style and the attachment style of the person that we are in relationship with, some really interesting stuff happens, right? And so your question is, to what extent can we change or can we augment that attachment style?
Well, and then also I think that is this something, it sounds like you didn't necessarily cover too much in your LMP training maybe. Like, is this a new thing, or is it kind of like a new theory that may work for a lot of people, or is it really something that's like the basis for a lot of things, or one way of thinking about stuff? Because it did speak to me, but also I was disappointed with how immutable it made these things feel like. I feel like it's already root to better.
Yeah. I mean, I think like one of my what's the word? Not criticism, but like one of my thoughts about the book is like living sort of makes you feel like if you have like an avoidant attachment style, like good luck. You'll be single for the rest of your life. Thanks a lot. So attachment style is old, right? They were doing research in the 60s. I don't think this research would be allowed anymore. But essentially what they would do is they would have the parent bring a child into a room. The child had never met the researcher before. Then the parent leaves the room and they see how the child responds. And then when the parent comes back, they see how the child responds then too, right? And then they coded based on his behavior, the extent to which they believed they were secure. The kid was like, bye mom. And then when they came back, they were like, hi mom, right? Avoidant, the parent leaves, the child ignores them, the parent comes back, the child still ignores them as a punishment. Or anxious, the parent goes to leave, the child's holding onto their leg, the parent finally comes, the parent's gone for 5 minutes and they come back and the child runs to them and they're crying, right? And that's how they coded the styles for children. So this research has been going on for a long time. It's not, like a newfangled thing in psychology. I think what I believe in is that we have the opportunity to change every single cell in our bodies, including, of course, our attachment style. So what that means is, so for those of you that are familiar with the concept of neuroplasticity, right? Neuroplasticity tells us that our brains, the neurons in our brains, which are the cells in our brains, are constantly regenerating, rewiring, regrouping in order to accurately reflect the external experience that we're having. Just a little example of neuroplasticity is if you go away on a vacation and you don't take your computer with you, and then you come back and you sit down to type some emails, and all of a sudden you're like, why am I hitting the wrong keys? Why are my hands sluggish? The neurons in your brain have already started to rewire away from how you use your hands to type because you haven't done it for a week. So neuroplasticity, our neurons are constantly shifting and changing. And so for us to say that there's some part of ourselves as humans that's completely immutable, that will never change in our whole lives in the, 15, 45, 75, 105 years that we're here, I'm not for that. I believe that there's a possibility, and this is the fifth practice of resilience, for us to change any aspect of ourselves that we desire to. When we put enough effort and enough focus and enough desire into wanting to be different, we can absolutely change it.
I think we have time for a couple more. Anybody?
So excited!
Nice to meet you. My name is Amira.
Hi, Amira. Nice to meet you.
So my question is, how much compromise is the right balance in a relationship? Because I feel like sometimes when you compromise too much on things that are really important, then I feel like, is it doomed to begin with? Because then that person is going to, obviously, there are going to be arguments and you're like on the edge, but then also, if you're never going to compromise, then I feel like you can never really get too far. So, yeah.
Whew, you guys brought it tonight. I love this. You said a couple of things in your question that are super important and powerful, right? Because you asked about compromise, and then you also talked about what's the response to that compromise, one of the things that we haven't touched on yet tonight is this idea of codependence. And codependence is about being connected to another human in a romantic relationship or otherwise, that is unhealthy. And what we mean by unhealthy is, in a way, culturally constructed, right? I mean, we have sort of a belief here in the Western society about independence and doing things on our own. You know, if you go over to Eastern societies, you know, folks aren't as focused on independence, and so they're going to see this idea of codependence in a different way. You know, in relationships, especially for women and for men too, we have a tendency to be the nurturers, and we have a tendency to give, and we have a tendency to give a lot. And so I think when we're thinking about a particular compromise, we get to ask ourselves 3 questions. The first question we get to ask ourselves is, can I compromise this thing in my life and still be true to myself? So if I've always wanted children and then I meet someone who doesn't want children, that perhaps is a compromise that is not going to allow me to be true to the essence of myself, right? So can I compromise and still be true to the essence of who I am? That's the first question, right? Second question is, has this person earned the right to receive my compromise? What have they offered you? I'm going to say some hypotheticals. What have they offered you in return for wanting you to move across the country for their job? What have they offered you, you know, in an equitable way inside of this relationship, right? And then the third piece is, to what extent is my compromise being appreciated? So can I stay true to myself? Has the person earned it? And do they appreciate it? And if the answer is no to any of those 3 questions, my professional advice is don't do it.
Do any of them.
Any of them. If they haven't earned it,
Am I staying true to myself?
are you, if it takes you away from the truth of yourself, if they haven't earned it, or if they don't appreciate it, because this is big for you, whatever this compromise is, I wouldn't do it.
Thank you so much.
In my complete amateur opinion, I agree.
I love amateur opinions.
I think we have time maybe for one more.
Yeah.
Anybody?
It's always that like one more where people are like, well, I don't want to be the one more. We have time for so many more.
Yes.
Ooh, back there.
I know, I'm just grateful. I watched your TED Talk and I loved like everything I've learned. And my favorite thing was using our resiliency and sharing it to heal others. So I just really appreciate everything you shared tonight.
Thank you. Did you tell us your name?
No, I didn't.
Do you want to?
Not really.
Okay, that's great. We want everyone to feel comfortable. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Should we wrap up with some final thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for traveling across the country to be part of this. I learned so much. I'm sure Hannah has so much ammo now for the next couple of weeks to be like, Dr. Taryn said this, so you're wrong. So thank you.
That's how I desire to show up in couples relationships, as ammunition.
Yeah, no, this was amazing. I think talking to you about resilience, there's so much crossover, whether it's being an entrepreneur or a relationship, and it's one of the most important words to me. So just learning more from you and building our community with you has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. You know, we can hang out for a little while, but either way, obviously we want you to grab a book. And Caitlin has giving keys on the table as well, so they'll both be here. So please feel free to stay and mingle. But thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and also,
And before you go, but you can go if you want to. But before you go, I want to thank all of you for being here. It means it means the world to me that I walked into this room and I saw all of your beautiful faces, and you showed up tonight with an open heart and a desire to learn and an interest in this topic. And so I'm so happy to see all of you, and I hope I get to meet all of you as well. I want to thank my friends here in LA who came to see me. I want to thank Debbie Goodman. I want to thank my boyfriend, Mike Alden. I want to thank Chris Pan and Elle Blink for being here. I want to thank Chase Bell there in the back. Chase is actually in the book. He's a beautiful singer, incredible. He's doing a song with Aloe Black. Should definitely get his autograph. It is going to be worth something like tomorrow, more than it is today. And Chase has a beautiful voice, and he actually was interviewed for the book and talked about his process of connecting deeply with himself and learning to love his own voice. I want to thank Mari Katsuya and Allison Albrecht for being here, for taking the time. Did I touch everyone? And I want to thank Caitlin Crosby for showing up tonight. I don't know if all of you know Caitlin. Caitlin has built a beautiful company over the years called The Giving Keys. And I'm just so impressed by what she's done. And I literally almost cried right before this, but I'm not vulnerable enough, so I didn't. And she gave me this beautiful key, and to receive a giving key from like the queen founder of the Giving Keys, she's all about putting possibility and love into the world. And the key, if you don't know, is about finding a key that has your word on it or something that speaks to you, and wearing it for a little while, and then coming across someone who needs that word, or who needs a level of encouragement, and passing it on and paying it forward. And perhaps one of her most famous moments is she gave a key to Harry Styles, which then he wore, you know. And last but not least, I want to thank my beautiful friend, Heather Mack, for being here. Heather's an incredible person. She's been on an amazing journey of self-love and healing for herself. And now she is working with other people to bring that self-love and healing to the world. And so deeply, deeply proud of her. And
I just want to say, like, I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Taryn. She changed my life tremendously, and she taught me what self-love was. I was making a joke earlier. She like picked me up like a wounded bird and like nurtured me back to life. And I was in a narcissistic relationship for years, and she was so gentle and loving and loved me through the whole process and took care of me and taught me what self-love is. And I wouldn't be the woman I am today without knowing her. So I owe really like a debt of gratitude to her. So thank you for being who you are and who you see today. She in her personal life is a tremendous human being. I'm so thankful for her. So.
Thank you, my beautiful friend. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't thank you first round on me and the way that you're bringing this way of conscious dating, of thoughtfulness, of integrity, of love, of divine masculinity and femininity and presence into the world. My God, the dating market needs it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And final thank you to our super producer, Dr. Celtics, and to the Soho House. We appreciate you.